It is our great pleasure today to host Professor Paul Antràs from Harvard University, where he has taught since 2003. He is an elected fellow of the Econometric Society and a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences in the United States, and has received numerous awards for his research, which focuses on international economics and applied theory. His most recent work, however, is focused on global value chains, the interplay between globalization and interest rates, and globalization and market power, and of course, international relations, which play a key role um, in all these things. The talk today is entitled "The Uncharted Waters of International Trade," and we are very excited to hear more about this because, of course, if it's uncharted, we don't know about it, and knowing about things that we don't yet know, it's always great. So thank you, Professor, and the floor is yours.
Gracias, Carlos. Thank you, Carlos. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen and tell me if it shows up as full screen, please. It does? Okay, it's good. You see a ship?
Yes, it's good. It's
Excellent.
full screen, yes.
All right, let me just close this on my end so that I don't have this bothering me. Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. There's three things I think that I thought Carlos would say, and he didn't. So let me say them myself. The first one, I think you forgot the most important thing, which is that I myself am an alumni of Pompeu Fabra. I did both my undergrad there, and I also did a master's. So I understand that the people attending the call are a combination of undergrads and master's students. So in short, I've been there, and so I share that with you guys. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, in terms of formatting, I think it's a little bit open-ended, but I will speak for maybe about 45 to 50 minutes. Okay, I plan to kind of keep it not too long. It's Friday afternoon. I don't like to do long, tedious things on Friday afternoons, and I don't think that you probably have the patience at this point. And I'm happy to stick around for Q&A, okay? And there's things I'm not going to talk about that you might have questions about. There might be things I talk about that I'm not clear enough about, and you might have questions. So I'm happy to stick around. The third thing is that I will speak for 45 to 50 minutes, but I don't need to speak in an uninterrupted manner. That is, I encourage questions at the end after I'm done, but I very much encourage questions as I go along. It's going to make it more fun for me and for you, or it's even important that you might get stuck with things, and I don't want that to happen. So please speak up. Don't raise your hand. I'm not going to be looking at the necessarily at the chat. So don't raise your hand or type on the thing. Just interrupt me. If you're shy, raise your hand and use the chat, and then I'm gonna ask Carlos to keep an eye on that, and then he can bring them up. But don't be shy. No need to put a camera or anything. But do interrupt me if you have questions. Okay, so that's that. Now let me get started. So what am I going to talk about? We were talking before we got started that the title of the talk was a little bit cryptic. Okay, so now I'm actually using a different title here, but it's all related, and it's all sort of related to a paper that, if you're curious and want to dig a little bit deeper into what I'm going to talk about, is a paper that was published last year. And basically, the background on the paper is an overview of what has been done in the trade field in recent years, but more importantly, what are the uncharted waters? What are the areas in the field where I think maybe there's been some work, but there's certainly a need for much more work. As a matter of background, just before we go into the specifics of the field, let me put forth the importance of the field. International trade, is an ancient field. It's one of the first fields in economics. Adam Smith talked a lot about trade. David Ricardo talked a lot about trade. Um, but so despite the fact that we entered this century with a very vast amount of conceptual frameworks to think about international trade, I think it is fair to say that the last 25 years have witnessed a massive transformation in the field. Okay, so if you look at PhD master's level syllabi of international trade courses, the vast majority of the papers you're going to be seeing in those syllabus are 21st century papers, which is not always the case in other fields. At the same time, this is amazing, right? It's amazing that we've had all this work because, currently, and today is an example of this, if you followed the news in the last couple of hours, there's an incredible amount of demand to understand what is happening on the trade side, on the trade policy side, the tariff wars, the Trump tariffs. Now, today we saw the tariffs have been repealed by the Supreme Court in the US. There's a lot of demand for expertise. I see it myself. I'm an academic. I spend most of the time with research. Occasionally, I talk to the press. I've never been asked so many times to talk to the press as in the last few years, thanks to what's been happening. Now, you might say that's great because if we have transformative developments, maybe we can give more informed answers than we did in the past. And I would say that's probably the case. That is, when we talk to the press, when we talk to policymakers, we are in a better position to provide useful feedback and advice that we did 25 years ago. But at the same time, I think there's still a lot of areas where I think our understanding is not sufficient. Okay, and I think we need to be modest. And part of the motivation for the paper that I wrote and for the presentation today is to outline areas where I think our models, which we base our advice on, are models that have some important limitations. Okay, so there's many uncharted waters in the field of international trade. And many of these things that I'm going to talk about, I think are going to be quite important, not just from the technical aspect of sort of pushing forth the frontier of research in a technical manner, but also because these are going to be important for providing robust policy advice. Okay, so the roadmap for the paper and for the presentation is first, I'm going to very quickly tell you about this so-called transformative developments. What is it that I have in mind for recently charted waters? And then having done that, and I'll spend quite a bit of time on this because I know that some of you might have taken some international trade courses, but others of you might have not. So I need to kind of give you a bit of background. Having told you about this, then I'm going to turn onto this uncharted waters. What are on the theory side, which are the areas where our models fall short? Okay, and I'm going to try to kind of emphasize the policy relevance of this. For those of you that are more interested in empirical matters, I'm also going to outline areas where I think much more empirical work is needed. Part of it is empirical work. A lot of what I have to say about this in the paper is related to data. Okay, a lot of the limitations are not that we haven't studied this empirically because we haven't thought about doing that. Is mostly the constraint has been data. Okay, so a lot of what I wrote about is how could we collect data in a manner different than it's being collected now, or used in a way that is different than it has been used up to now, to make it more useful. And then I have some thoughts at the end on policy matters, but I'm not sure I'm going to have much time to talk about that. Okay. All right, so on the charted waters, these transformative developments in the paper, the background paper, I outline four main areas. Okay, and the first one is what we've come to refer to as the firm level approach to international trade, basically moving away from models in which countries trade with each other, which is what you've seen in undergrad courses. England trades with Portugal. No, it's not countries that trade with each other. It's firms. Firms export, firms import, firms are mediating trade. So thinking about trade from the perspective of firm level decisions, that's been, I think, a very dominant development in recent years. The theorizing and the empirical work on this so-called global value chains that Carlos has mentioned at the beginning, and the role of multinational firms in shaping those global value chains. A lot of work on this in the 20th century, but a lot of the most recent work has actually shed a lot of new insights, I think. There's been a quantitative revolution in the field. For those of you that come from a macro perspective, this might seem surprising because there's a great amount of quantitative work in macro, the RBC models, New Keynesian models. There's a bunch of stuff where there's been a lot of interplay between, a lot of calibration work. In trade, there's been a lot of estimation in the past, but less calibration. Okay, and starting with the work of Eaton and Cordham, that's really taken off in the field. And then I'm not going to have time to talk about this, but I try to argue that empirical work in trade has also changed in a notable way, in the sense that it's become much more, I say, unshackled or undisciplined from theory. In the past, empirical work in trade was almost always about testing theories. A lot of the most exciting, in my view, recent empirical work in trade is not trying to test theories, it's shedding new light on stuff without necessarily a particular model in mind. And I think I'm a theorist myself by heart, but I found this very inspiring and very illuminating. Okay, so these are four ways to think about it. You can think about papers that would fall into one or two of these categories, but I'm going to just separate them for the sake of exposition. So what is the firm level approach to trade? As I mentioned before, is the idea that we're not just countries trading with each other or industry output being exchanged for industry output of other industries in other countries, but it's putting firms at the center stage. Okay. Why is it that the field turned that way? Um, you might say, well, because that's trying to write down models that are realistic. Yes and no. I mean, we don't always want realism, right? If we wanted realism, our models would be incredibly complicated. We'd try to kind of make it as realistic as possible, and then they would cease to be useful. Okay, so we're always abstracting from things. We had this firm level revolution because we understood, and a bunch of empirical work, Andy Bernard at Dartmouth and collaborators, showed us that the fact that firms mediate trade is very important for understanding some salient features of the data. The first one is the skewed distribution of exporters and importers. That is, if you want to try to understand the amount of exports from a given country in a given sector, think about the chemical sector in Spain, how much does it export to other countries? Turns out that if you understand the behavior of the largest of these firms, the largest exporters, you account for a huge percentage of exports. Okay, so for the case of the US, the top 1%, take 100 firms in a sector, okay? The top one, the biggest of those, would account for 80% of US exports and imports. Okay, so the very top firms account for a vast majority of imports and exports. So that calls into question models where maybe you model firms like Paul Krugman did in his work in the 1980s, but you treat all firms as being identical. They're like representative firm models. Those are obviously not going to be able to account for this. Okay, so it's not just that firms are not similar, they're very, very different. And if you nail the behavior of the bigger ones, you nail a huge percentage of trade flows. The second one is that we've observed, and that is not only coming from trade, but from industrial organization too, the idea that within sectors, firms vary a lot in their productivity. Okay, so some are large and some are small, but a lot of that variation is tied to their productivity, and that is correlated with trade participation. Okay, it's not only the case that you have a small number of firms that account for a huge percentage of trade, but as I hinted before, these are also relatively more productive firms. Okay, so that is important because it's going to give ways to model heterogeneity within sectors in a systematic manner. You could probably generate something that looks like this with a sort of a random model where some firms export, others don't. And then if you have enough granularity, you might get this. But there's a lot of systematic evidence that says don't just work with probabilities. There's systematic reasons why some firms are going to export and others don't. So let's try to write down models that account for this. A third sort of very important aspect here that I think was key for sort of this literature gaining ground is the idea that even if you only care about macro, okay, suppose that all I care about is Spain export flows. Where is Spain exporting? Which countries is Spain exporting goods to? It's going to turn out to be the case that what we call the extensive margin of trade, which is the set of firms, the number of firms that are going to be selling to different markets, that is by far the most important margin in understanding those exports. Okay. In a representative firm model, you'd have the same type of firms, the same set of firms selling to France, selling to Korea. And the fact that Spain sells more to France, exports more to France than to Korea, you'd say that's because all these firms sell more to France than they sell to Korea. But that's not how the world works. The world is one in which there are way many more Spanish firms that sell in France than there are Spanish firms that sell in Korea. Yes, maybe those that sell in France, they sell a little bit more in France than they sell in Korea if they sell to both markets. But those differences are not as large as just the differences coming from the fact of way many more firms selling to nearby markets and bigger markets than firms selling to further away markets. Okay, so um, this extensive margin, understanding why some firms export and others don't, why they export to some markets and others don't, that has there's a lot of evidence that that is a first order issue in understanding aggregate trade flows. So the empirical literature gave rise to conceptual frameworks. The most notable one is by a colleague of mine at Harvard, Mark Melitz, who has this very famous 2003 Econometrica paper. It's probably one of the most cited papers in economics in this century, probably top five, I'd venture. A highly cited paper, which basically takes the canonical model of trade up to that point, which is the Krugman 1980 paper, and then added to it this intra-industry heterogeneity in productivity. Okay, there's an industry, but instead of all firms in an industry being symmetric, he introduced some notion of heterogeneity. He, as in many other frameworks, I'll talk about this later, and I'm not going to get into technical aspects, but I need to say I need to use some jargon. As in the Krugman model, the way this industry is modeled is one in which there's many firms, but what these firms sell is not the same exact good. There's some differentiation. Okay, so consumers view some of this firms out, the firm output of some firms different from those of others, with some degree of substitution across those varieties. Market structure, monopolistic competition. Okay, so there is market power. Firms have market power. They obtain profits, but there's no strategic interactions. Okay, and then scale economies. These models have scale economies in the sense that in order to produce, or in the Malitz framework, in order to export, firms need to pay some overhead costs, so that the more they sell, the more they move down their average costs. Okay. So it's a very straightforward extension of Malitz. One of the spaces like, oh, I wish I had come up with this, because it's not, there's some intricate stuff in the paper, but it's a very straightforward extension, but it's beautiful in the sense that you just add this, and then all the facts that I started with in the previous slide all are explained by that framework. Okay, so you have this is good theory, right? You get a very high rate of return. What are the extra assumptions? What are the extra results? If you take a model, a well-known model. This is just a bit of a silly comment, but it might be useful for those of you that envision an academic career. If you take a baseline model, you add an assumption, you get one extra result, people are not going to be impressed. Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, you change this, you get one. The nice theories are theories where you, out of a set of assumptions, you get a lot of results. Out of an extra assumption, you get a lot of things that help you understand the world. And that's a very good example of a good rate of return in terms of theory. Now, the Malitz framework emphasized the exporting decision, and indeed, the Bernard empirical papers very much focus on exporting. There's a parallel literature on the importing decision, okay? Because in standard trade models, going back to David Ricardo, on the consumption side, what you have is consumers. Consumers have some preferences over goods, they demand goods, and then exporters ship those goods to consumers. So these are models, the Malitz framework being an example of this, in which all trade is in final goods. In reality, that's not how the world works, in the sense that about 70% of world trade is in intermediate inputs, components, not finished products. And those inputs, those components are not just exported by firms, but they're also imported by firms that are importing those components and then they process them into maybe finished goods or other more advanced inputs. So there's the exporting decision, then there's the importing decision. And that you'd think, well, it's the flip side, it's the same transaction. Does it matter which side you look at? From a conceptual point of view, models of importing are much more complicated to deal with. And I don't have time to tell you about the details about why that is the case. But it turns out that these models are much richer. In one word or one sentence, the decisions to import are much more interact much more with other import decisions than export decisions interact with other export decisions. Okay, and that basically enriches both the set of uh, um, uh, tools that you need to solve these models, but also importantly, it enriches the set of implications. So I've done some work on that. I'll come back to a variant of that later. Another aspect that arises when you start thinking about importing, to some extent exporting as well, but importing, is the idea that a lot of the outsourcing, subcontracting tied to importing in the 21st century and even earlier happened in low-wage countries. So you have firms that were producing some things. You have the chemical firm in Sabadell or textile firm in Sabadell that moved the factory to Eastern Europe. Okay. Um, these low-wage countries are often countries that tend to have weaker contract enforcement. Okay, so that begs the question of how do firms navigate the contractual environment? And I spent a lot of time early in my career, starting with my PhD thesis, thinking about those aspects. They matter for exporting too. And I have some work on this, and you might face some uncertainty when you export and you sell to messed up markets. Are they going to pay you and things like that? But on the importing side, it's very clear that contractual aspects matter. What have we learned from all this literature? It's not just about there's these new facts, and now we have theories to account for these facts. I think, and going back to what I was mentioning before, it's equipped us to talk to policymakers in ways that are more informative than in the past. When you start having models of where there's some distribution of exporters, you can start making sense of why the size distribution of firms may matter. It doesn't matter, for instance, in Spain before the great financial crisis, Spanish exports were very much concentrated in a handful of very small firms. The small and medium enterprises, they were not very much engaged in trade. The Great Recession changed things a little bit. It threw a lot of firms on export markets. There was a lot of discussion about how the size distribution, las pymes in Spain, I mean, do they need to export or not? Why are they exporting or not? These are frameworks that help you think about that. I found myself in the early 2000s talking to policymakers and using the frameworks that were being developed, which was kind of cool. They're good frameworks to think about export promotion and informational friction, the idea that you might want to help some firms to export in other markets, maybe because they're small, they don't really know there's some barriers to exporting, but they might learn from others. So this idea of firms putting yourselves in the shoes of a manager and what are the frictions that they're facing and how does the government can come in and help them somehow. Okay, so again, that sort of flashes this much more, and it's been shown to be helpful for policy prescriptions. Models of political economy, less about the design of policies, more the positive aspects of how does policy actually take place, right? So there's a vast literature on the role of lobbying in shaping trade policies. We have some tariffs in some cases, clearly not because they're necessarily social welfare maximizing, but because they're really good for some firms, and firms spend a lot of time and money trying to influence policymakers. In models with many firms that are different, there's free riding problems. There's a lot of interesting aspects in lobbying models that the literature has worked out, both theoretically and empirically. And on the contractual environment, obviously, models with contractual frictions, they are typically they're not always work the same way that neoclassical frameworks would work or models with perfect contracting, and that has led to some insights. I've joined work with Bob Steger, who's now the chief economist at the WTO, or will become the chief economist at the WTO, where we try to kind of think a little bit about how the design of the WTO interacted with these frictions. So that's in terms of the firm level approach. And obviously, we could spend a whole hour talking about that literature. Let me talk about the different literature, which is, I already hinted at this before, which is there's all these models of exporting, but they're models with final good trade. But the modern economy is very different than this. And it's not just about the fact that firms are on the import side as well. It's a more sort of a broader conceptual point, which is that when many trade economies days when they observe customs forms, you see an import-export transaction. You immediately try to think about what is this part of, right? This is not just a Ukrainian exporter of corn or whatever wheat selling to some foreign markets for foreign consumers. A lot of the transactions are little parts that are going to go into some other parts that are going to go into an end product, maybe a car. So all these transactions are part of much bigger value chains. And more, how we think about trade is as this slices, various slices of these global value chains. And that begs the question of whether we can look at each of these transactions and study them in isolation as an exporter selling to some buyers abroad. And the answer is yes, of course, we can treat them as independently. The issue is what's the loss of that? And if we do so, what are we missing, or in which ways our models may be misleading? So there's a whole literature that has been thinking about this, which is the interdependencies of trade transactions. Obviously, you might say, well, international trade is all about interdependencies. General equilibrium, the idea that if trade is roughly balanced, export and imports cannot go out of whack. Something's going to move. Relative wage is going to move, and exchange rate is going to move. Obviously, there are interdependencies. There's also models with industry interdependencies. If some exporters grow a lot, they bid up some price, and then others are going to export less. But this is different. These are firm level or chain level interdependencies. If I'm in a chain and something, suppose that I'm importing all these parts from these various countries, I could be importing something from France and it goes beautifully well. But if I have a disruption with another input, that's going to change my demand for the French parts because maybe I anticipate that with this disturbance, like I was importing something from China, it doesn't come in time. That's going to reduce everything or it's going to delay everything. That's going to change all my orders. Okay, so there's a natural interdependencies that arise in these frameworks. Um, this literature has also sort of argued that, I mean, one way to think about value chains is a bunch of agents that are just thinking narrowly about their import decisions, export decisions, in the same way that, in a general equilibrium framework, agents are only looking like narrowly at their decisions. But this is not how the world works. I didn't bring any examples. I have one coming up, but if you start looking at realistic value chains, specific ones, it's very clear that they're often organized by lead firms. And these lead firms are not just deciding what to buy or sell, but they're often dictating what their suppliers should be doing or what the users of their goods should be using. So there's much more of a planner kind of our aspect to it, which has sort of led to frameworks that make sense of this. Why is it that we have this multinational firms doing all this organizing? And that have studied the implications of that. To give you an example, as I mentioned, as an example coming up, the semiconductors would be an example of all these sort of conceptual aspects, which is it's an industry that produces at the end product is a very small thing. It's a chip, but as you know, in the production of chip, there's a lot of things that are happening to get the chip. From the purification of silicon, the cutting into wafers, the wafer fabrication, which is the core of the industry, but then there's still the assembly and so on. So, these things are just going from country to country at these various stages, and they're crossing borders, they're being recorded in customs forms at different levels of completion. Obviously, the trade transaction at stage 6 is a function of what happened in 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so you might want to have a model where you're not just looking at a trade transaction independently of others, but you're trying to model a sequential production process where there's various stages, they're all affecting each other, and then you kind of build this into a general equilibrium framework. In terms of multinationals, again, you could think about Intel, you can think about Qualcomm, or even NVIDIA, and like different nodes on this value chain and how important they are as multinational firms. Uh, to give you a broader sense, more systematic sense of their importance in U.S. manufacturing, there's about a quarter of a million firms, 250,000 firms that do some manufacturing in the U.S. Multinationals are very few of them. There's only about 1.5% of firms that are either US-based multinationals that then have affiliates abroad, or they're US affiliates of foreign firms. Think about Toyota US would be down here. So not that many of them, but they're massive. They account for 57% of manufacturing employment, 76% of sales, and close to 90% of US imports and exports. Okay. What does that mean? It means that if you are interested in understanding aggregate US imports and exports, you should bear in mind that a huge percentage of those flows are associated with firms that by their nature are doing other stuff in other countries. Toyota obviously has a presence in the US, but it has a presence in many, many countries. Ford is US-based multinational, but has plans in a bunch of places on Earth. Okay, and in fact, um, the foreign operations of these firms are almost as large as their US operations. Okay, so there's a lot of reasons for why shocks that could happen very far away might affect the US import and export transactions of about 90% of trade flows. Okay, so that's something that traditional models ignore, and I think that's not without cost. There's been a literature on all this, and I don't know if, we could talk about global value chains at some other point. And I've been, as Carlos was saying at the beginning, I spent the better part of the last 10 years, if not longer, thinking about these animals. And, I think there's been some valuable lessons in what we've gained from this. Thinking about intermediate input trade and how distinct it is from final good trade, rethinking the China shock literature is treating US imports from China as an import competition shock. We opened up to China, the Chinese producers came and they wiped out a bunch of US producers. Yes, that's part of the China shock, but the China shock is also a bunch of US producers that moved their operations, their manufacturing to China. By doing so, they were able to cut costs, focus on R&D, product development, etc. They became very profitable. They hired a bunch of people in the US and those other tasks. It's a much more complex shock. And some aspects are negative for sure, but some aspects are positive and might explain why some firms have grown so much. Think about Apple. Was Apple have grown as much without Foxconn operations in China? I doubt it. I mean, if they would have produced at much higher cost, demand would have been much lower. The effects of tariffs are very different on inputs and final goods. The welfare implications of trade are very different. They tend to get much bigger gains from integration and losses from tariffs in models with global value chains. The third aspect of the charted waters is this quantitative trade revolution, okay, which is not only are we thinking about low dimensional models, two countries, two goods, think about Ricardian models, the stuff that maybe in the masters you start with a very simple stylized models. Now we are writing multi-country models that we try to fit to multi-country data, either gravity style, bilateral trade data, or world input-output tables. This existed already. There was something called computable general equilibrium models in the 20th century. The Ethernet Quorum revolution is basically taken off because the frameworks are in this middle ground where they're not as opaque as computable general equilibrium models, which are very ugly models, and you don't really know why you're getting the effects you're getting. There's some transparency in this sort of medium scale models, but they're medium scale in the sense that they're not simplistic. They're not always very simplistic. That you can fit the data, for instance, you can fit the data, and in fact, by construction, one often assumes that you fit the data exactly, and that's why. A nice aspect, some people argue, of this line of modeling is that uh, you can specify models that are unbeatable in terms of model fit. You can always calibrate parameters to ensure that your model fits the data exactly. That often is forgotten that is problematic, right? In the sense that one might worry about a problem of overfitting. Okay, so if you remember your econometrics, if I gave you a scatter plot of points, maybe 12 points, you all learned that if you wanted to kind of write down an empirical model to account for that cloud of points, you'd run a regression and figure out what's the best fit, right? But if there's 12 points, a polynomial of sufficient degrees is actually going to nail the data. So if the unique goal was to minimize distance between data and prediction, data and model, I mean, you could do that with a high dimensional polynomial. But we know that's problematic because we write down empirical models for prediction purposes. We want to know if we change and there's a tariff war, what's going to happen. Okay. So I'm being a bit, I know this is recorded, so I'm a little bit worried. So I'm being oversimplistic, but to some extent, what this quantitative trait revolution is doing is fitting 12-degree polynomials to the data. Okay, it's not exactly that, but we're basically calibrating, imposing hundreds, if not thousands of parameters to make sure that we fit the data exactly. And that has there's some issues. There's alternative approaches on my own research, empirical research, that's what I followed, which is more in line with industrial organization. Understanding that you not all necessarily want to fit the data exactly, that you want a model that approximately fits the data, and you want to understand if it doesn't fit the data exactly, where is that error term coming from? How do I model the error term? And then once you understand the error term, you can sort of write down models that pick parameters that minimize that error and its structure. Okay, so I find this a little bit more transparent or reliable or robust. The issue is that it's much more complicated to do. Because there's a lot of it's really very cool. This Eaton encoding stuff is very cool. There's a lot of magic in it, and it allows you to perform counterfactuals super quickly, but at some cost. Just to give you an example, there's a recent paper in the JIE that estimated the cost of tariff wars, and it concluded that an economy like Taiwan was going to benefit from a tariff war, which to me makes absolutely no sense. Okay, and there's reason to worry that there's some misspecification in these models that deliver some sort of funny or unrealistic predictions. I'll skip the empirical work on shackled because I don't want to talk for too long. And if it's mostly, if you're curious about the papers I have in mind, just go to the papers on my website, open access, and you can dig into. Let me now turn to the uncharted waters, and I'm going to do so quickly, and just give you a little big brush, una pinzellada, that you say in Catalan, of what I have in mind. So in the paper, I outline various areas of where I think that despite all this work, we need more work. One is in terms of the modeling of market structure. Okay, so every single model that I've sort of described or invoked is a model with monopolistic competition. Yes, market power. We know that market power is important. We work mostly with models with market power, but monopolistic competition is at odds with a lot of the things that I see in the data. I'll dig a little bit deeper into that. The second is national security. That sort of connects more with recent events, geoeconomics, geopolitics. It's hard to think about trade policy these days without thinking about aspects related to national security. This is not just about terms of trade manipulation or creating jobs in the US. A lot of these policies have very clear geoeconomic aspects in mind. So this was fairly uncharted when I started writing this. There's a whole emerging field of geoeconomics that's shedding light on these issues. Behavioral economics, I think this is where, honestly, when I wrote this up, my colleagues, my friends gave me the hardest time about, are you going behavioral? It seems like a curse word in international trade. But I'm going to try to argue briefly that we need to think about some aspects of behavioral economics. We haven't paid enough attention to it. And it connects with the fourth topic, which is the issue of redistribution policies. We get a lot of heat. I get a lot of heat when I go to places. They say, "Oh, you trade economists, you're propaganda, you're all free trade. You're always saying trade is a good thing, and you never point out that there's some cost to trade." And I'm saying, of course we are. I mean, this is like our main theorems are all about the distributional effects from trade. Think about Stolper-Samuelson. It says uh, there's going to be some factors that are going to be hurt by trade. And that's unfair. At the same time, we say, yeah, but they can be compensated. So let's not put trade frictions and not put tariffs because if we want to compensate the losers, the right way to do so is through the tax system and not through tariffs. Okay. Which is a good point, except that if we leave it at that, then it's sort of not very clear what a policymaker can do with that. So I think we need more work to help policymakers design redistribution policies that target the losers, that minimize the distortions that are coming with this redistribution, but that actually help the folks that are being displaced by trade. There is no there's no Trump without a China shock. You know, we can debate about Otto Dorn and Hansen, is the estimate right or not? I don't know, but there's a widespread perception in the US that the China shock was very harmful to many people in the US. Okay. And nothing was done or very little was done to help those people. And now we have, we ended up with a president that ran on a very anti-trade platform. Okay. So it is in our own interest to be much more clear about how the losses come about and how we can deal with them. In the paper, I talk about the data economy and trade and culture, but I'm not going to have time to talk about that. So let me just dig in. I think compensation, I won't say much more than I've said, but on oligopoly, what I have in mind is very simple. I showed you already 1% of exporters accounts for 90% of trade flows. That basically means for the typical country and sector, there's 1, 2 firms that are relevant for exporting. And they're competing with each other, maybe competing with some foreign competitors. But the market structure is such that there's a small number of very large exporters. And, there's even industries where concentration is much larger, where really you only have like 1 or 2 firms globally, not just at the country level, but globally. Multinational firms, which feature a lot in recent models, those industries, the industries where multinationals are particularly concentrated. Okay. So, does it make sense to treat this industries as sort of monopolistically competitive, where firms are not sort of reacting to what other firms are doing, where profit margins are eroded by a process of entry? No. I mean, we know markups have been on the rise. Uh, we know we know when we talk to business people that they very much keep an eye on what their competitors are doing. And if their competitors do something, maybe that's going to lead them to do this, the same thing or something else. There's a lot of decisions, entry decisions, that are reacting to what other firms do. And that is something that our current models really don't say much about. There is a literature on oligopoly in trade, massive literature in the 80s and 90s. But what I have in mind is more work on the extensive margin of trade. Decisions to export that respond to competitors deciding to export. Decisions to offshore that are triggered by the need to cut costs because my competitors are cutting costs. And if I don't do this, I'm getting driven out of the market. This is all very intuitive. You might say, well, of course, that seems very reasonable. My claim is there's basically very few models that actually try to model this. Okay. And I think it's very, very important. National security, I said it in passing, geopolitical tensions, um, um, and it's clear that for certain goods, we want to design trade policies that bear in mind national security. And there's been some of that. Obviously, I don't think that the US has ever permitted the exporting of nuclear warheads to Iran. Okay. That obviously there's some sense of that, but there's a deeper sense now that with this very complex supply chains, you might have some firms in your country, think about semiconductor firms, that are exporting chips to some countries. And maybe those chips, rather than going into the cell phones that we then re-import and use, they might go into military stuff and it's going to come back to bite us. Okay, so there's an increasing sense that we might want to regulate trade because goods sometimes have a dual use nature. This is not potatoes are something I eat. I don't fight with potatoes. I mean, you could, I guess, but you wouldn't be very effective. There's nuclear warheads that are only used for military, but not for consumption. But in the middle, there's a lot of goods that could be used for either way. Okay, so there's some work trying to model this and make provide policies that are in line with this. And geopolitics is not going to go away. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. And what my main call in the paper is to basically for folks to think harder about what is the objective function that policymakers should have when they design optimal policy. In the same way that when we teach optimal tariffs, we work with neoclassical models that emphasize terms of trade manipulation, and there the objective function of the policymaker is social welfare maximization. The same way that we have political economy models, think about Grossman and Heldman, where politicians, maybe they care about the well-being of society, but also about their own well-being, and maybe they care about being reelected, and that makes them cater to the needs of some industries that are going to provide contributions, financial contributions, that's going to allow them to run a better campaign, that's going to keep them in power. Okay, so there's this biases coming from lobbying. And in that case, it's very clear that the politician is maximizing a combination of social welfare and their own individual welfare. But how do we make sense of Putin's invasion of Ukraine or the US being completely obsessed with Greenland? Okay. This is all about national security. Okay, this is not imperialism per se, but there are, we can debate about how justified those national security concerns are. But more and more, we are seeing policies that have national security in mind. But what is national security? How do I think about that in a welfare model? Okay, I care about consumption, and then I care about national security. What does it mean, national security? It's not obvious how to think about that trade-off. Just to put it, I have that. But basically, there's models I have thought about situations in which I have in mind the work of majority and co-authors. They care about consumption and then some other stuff that is some black box externality. Okay, and then if I sell this, though I sell a nuclear warhead, that's going to have a negative externality on me. So I want to restrict that export because it's going to have a negative. Yeah, you can do that, but I'm calling for opening that black box a bit more. Thinking about is national security is something about the survival of the state. So that has some conflict probability maybe that I'm going to enter a conflict. If I enter a conflict with a country, I want to be prepared as possible, and I want them to be as least prepared as possible. So that ex ante is going to lead me to not export some things that are going to strengthen their power. So it's a more explicit modeling of wherever it is, that is sort of in the policymaker's mind. And Greenland is something about the North Passage, being navigable, and then China presumably having missiles close enough to the US. Okay, so thinking about this more explicitly in the same way that lobbying models thought explicitly about lobbying, I think that's the way to go. Okay. Behavioral economics, again, I told you I've got some heat because, the typical trade economist would tell you, hey, firms, we're all about firms. Firms are profit maximizing. Yeah, maybe not always, isn't that? But, the large, 90% of trade flows are accounted for by very large firms that don't make a lot of mistakes. Okay, so not the most suitable place to think about behavioral economics. And on the consumption side, a lot of evidence of many, many behavioral biases, but it's not very clear that those behavioral biases, endowment effects, the hyperbolic discounting, all this stuff, how does that affect trade? It's not very clear. But what I argue is there is a role for behavioral economics because I don't think people necessarily understand exactly how trade impacts an economy. People have some views on how trade affects things, but very often those are they're systematic biases. We tend to there's ample survey evidence that suggests that perceptions of trade are not well captured by our models. When it comes to the gains, okay, it's very hard for people to kind of fully perceive the gains from trade. When it comes to the costs, those are much more salient. That is, I'm in the US, maybe, and suppose I was in an area in the US which was heavily hit by the China shock. I might see a lot of people around me, relatives, people that I interact through schools or something. I keep hearing about stories of people being laid off. Okay. And it's very salient. It's very clear in my mind that the jobs are being drained. Then I'm gonna go to Walmart and or Target or one of these places and I'm gonna buy stuff. And a trade economist would be telling you, look at how cheap this stuff is, right? I mean, you're getting the gains because you're buying all this stuff much more cheaply than you would buy it if it was not coming from China. But it's hard to make that. You know, how do I know what's a counterfactual price? Okay, it's not easy. I mean, I've lived in the U.S. for many years, and you know, the prices of things have not gone down a lot. And I realize, I mean, you know, I'm a trade economist. So I know, well, of course they haven't gone down because there's a process of inflation. So I should be thinking about relative prices, and the relative price of jeans and restaurants, that's gone down massively. I pay about the same for jeans as I paid 20 years ago. Restaurants are like twice as expensive, if not three times. So I know how to think about relative prices, but many people do not. It's hard to perceive those gains from trade. Um, so maybe we should be mindful of that. Why? Because we care about people's welfare, but we also care about what they vote and how they see things. And if we're not mindful of those biases, we try to educate them or we try to design policies that internalize those biases, we are going to be repeating what's been happening, which is we're going to put in place policies that the vast majority of people are not going to like, and then we're going to end up with anti-trade uh, politicians being elected and creating havoc. Okay. Redistribution compensation I've mentioned, so I'm not going to go back to that. And I'm mindful of time. Maybe let me take less than 5 more minutes and tell you briefly about what's in the rest of the slides on the paper. On the empirical waters, I told you it's about empirics, but a lot of it is about data. Okay. What should we do differently with the data? And what do we need in terms of collection to answer questions for which I don't think we have good answers? And these are some of the questions I have in mind, which hopefully you'll agree are important, which is export promotion. We have theories of why you might want to have export promotion. We have some evidence from some small scale studies of how they work, but we lack large scale export promotion experiments. Okay, so we need uh, uh, researchers to interact with governments and sort of do this in a way that allows for identification. We have some information on global value chains, and I show you that graph with uh, semiconductors. I'd love to have very detailed information on many value chains. Who are the players? What are they transacting? We don't have that data because you need to put together many customs forms to generate those value chains. Issues of the separation between physical production and diffusion of knowledge and how it interacts with national security, environmental issues of, you know, a lot of people concerned about the growth of global value chains because all this stuff is flowing back and forth. The carbon imprint of trade is much larger than it used to be. There's no doubt about it. So, but how much larger? And what is the overall effect of trade on the environment? Services. A lot of the theories of trade are trade in manufacturing goods or goods, but you know, trade in services is on the rise. Services generally are on the rise. It's a larger share of GDP in most countries accounted for by services. So we need better both modeling and measurement of services. Okay, on the policy front, and I'll end with this. Uh, just a bunch of questions. I may not just read them, but these are questions that I think you would all agree are of first order of importance. And I would argue that the answers that are coming from research at this point are only of limited use. Okay, so I get asked about these things and I provide some answers, but I'm always a bit tentative. And I wish and I hope that future research is going to help us answer this better. Okay, let me just conclude with a quote. Okay, so for those of you that are envisioning a career in international trade, it's often tempting to think that, oh my God, there's been 25 of all this work in the field. These guys have like sorted out everything. Okay, and it's all being sorted out. and there's no area in which there's a low-hanging fruit. Okay, the point of writing this paper is that I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. And more generally, the idea that we have complete theories is often a silly vision. Okay, and just to illustrate this, I have this quote from a famous economist that argued a while back that he had worked out a complete theory of international trade with all the details taken into account. And that was Pareto, 100 more than 125 years ago. Okay, so he was clearly wrong. We're not working with his model. In the same way, I don't think that the Smalet's Zidane and Gordon frameworks are necessarily going to be the frameworks they're going to be working with in the next 50 years. So it's up to you guys, the new generation, to provide those frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We'll start the turn of questions. The chat is empty, so please, people, you can speak up. Um, so yeah, you can just unmute yourself and just ask any questions you might have.
Ask a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a question regarding China because I think it's one of, for me, it's one of the most interesting countries. Because, for example, international finance models usually and international trade models usually try to make predictions, and often China happens that is able to go off the charts. So it's really hard to predict. I think maybe because of the government intervention. And so what I wanted to know is, since the 1980s to the more to the 2000s, China has been exporting a lot. It has reduced its consumption a lot, and in some sense, for consumption to eventually level, China should eventually begin importing more, meaning it should stop becoming this global exporter. And as the economy matures, it should become more of an importer. So I wanted to know, once China's economy matures, which is going to be the next player that you think is going to step up and take up that space that China's leaving behind in the future? Or do you think that's not going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Obviously, a very good question, and a lot to parse there. Let me start with the last thing you said. I do think the China thing is quite unique, okay? Um, because at the moment it happened, in the sense of the share of world population that they were accounting for, where they were coming from in terms of low wages and the massive productivity growth, where I agree the government had a lot to do with it in ways that our models not always sort of pay justice to. Um, I don't see a new China coming up, okay? And in fact, um, I think a lot of the reason why we are where we are is because people just didn't realize just how big of a shock that was going to be. I mean, the US had gone through a similar shock in the 70s and 80s with Japan. Okay, and a lot of freaking out about Japanese competition. There were massive debates about NAFTA in the 80s and then especially in the 90s when it actually happened and what Mexico was going to do. Um, but those were limited. Why? Because, at the end of the day, the Japanese economy and the Mexican economies were not all that large. Okay. China started being a small economy, but, with a massive population and you start having income growth at the rate they had, and quickly it became just a massive economy and was taking over one manufacturing sector after another. So I don't think that's gonna, what's next? I mean, yes, Indonesia is a large economy. You can think about Africa. The demographics in some countries in Africa might indicate growth if their income grows. But I don't think it's just hard to imagine that something coordinated, driven by a central government, would have the impact that we witnessed. Okay. Now, in terms of where I see China going, I don't know actually. I mean, um, you know, it's not obvious that the trade surplus will vanish. I mean, surplus. I personally tend to think about savings, finance, investment as sort of the key to that. And the issue is, as long as the Chinese find that investments abroad are more profitable than investments at home. And as long as they keep saving and saving, um, that's just not going to go away anytime soon. Having said that, to the extent that it's sort of it's not a planned economy, but it's sort of a heavily directed one, what you do hear from policymakers in recent months is that um, they are leaning against a little bit against the reorientation of all the flows that were flowing from China to the US. You may know that um, China accounted for like 20% of US, more than 20% of US imports. It's now down to 8%. That means the tariff war has really reduced the ability of Chinese firms to sell in the US. Those exports are flowing to other countries. You guys are in the EU, you know there's a lot of anxiety about we're gonna get flooded. There was all this stuff about the EVs and like we limit the imports of EVs from China. My understanding is that Chinese economy, Chinese policymakers, they want to put some rein on that because they know that if they let that happen, that's going to alienate everybody. Everybody's going to turn anti-China, and that in the long run is not a good thing. So they're trying to boost domestic demand and trying to reorient these sales into the domestic market, more in the domestic market than on export. But again, maybe, but I mean, I tend to think about trade balance as sort of a macro savings investment type of thing, and that's I mean it's not obvious that that's going to work very well.
Thank you.
So I
I
wanted to, if
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, you talked a little bit about growth, but you also talked about politics, and I wanted to ask you in the intersection between politics, growth, and maybe industrial development. So the case of Spain, for example, well, in the past couple of years, in Europe specifically, there's been a lot of talk of reformation, of how to improve the economy, how to stay competitive, right? And in the case of Spain specifically, the economy is very tertiarized, it's very dependent on tourism. So one of the things I learned very, very, very early when I was studying economics is that it might make sense in countries that are starting to develop to close the economy, right? Or to not open it immediately. So my question is, would um, in the case of Europe or Spain, for example, is trade policy a good way to start to think about restructuring the economy, or is it not a good tool? Maybe it would be a better way to express it. Is that a tool we can think about, or would that not make sense?
This is a very broad question. Okay, you're asking me, I think, what are my views about industrial policy? Okay, it's trade policy, but it's broader. It's industrial policy, and you worried me a little bit in you saying that one of the first things you learned
Well,
is
not
that
the first, but it's one of the things that stuck because you hear that trade is good. That's fundamental. But one of the thing I learned, maybe I have to relearn it. That's okay too. But one of the things I've heard is that in the countries that's starting to develop, it might make sense to have some sense
yes.
of
So
protectionism. I don't know if I'm explaining myself.
I wouldn't object to the notion that laissez-faire is not necessarily the right policy when less developed economies try to integrate in world markets. Um, from moving from that to the idea that you might want to have tariffs during the initial phases to protect your producers, there's a big, big jump. Okay. Um, in the sense, first, empirically, there's a lot of economies that tried those so-called import substitution policies in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the 20th century, and it was a disaster. Okay. And, there's still debates. There's folks like my colleague, Daniel Roderick, seems to have mixed views about it and feels like it was actually not working that badly. But, Brazil was closed for many decades and they have very little to show for it.
Right.
Okay, I don't know of any Brazilian-made cars like brands, and
Right.
things like that. They were trying to kind of push for all these industries, and they wasted a lot of money, and it didn't go anywhere.
Right.
At the same time, I'm not as naive as other like free traders that say, look, the right mode is like this export approach where you don't put tariffs, but you just basically rely on your firms exporting and you maybe subsidize them. Yes, that there was some of that, like the East Asian tigers, and China certainly fits that mold. But these were not just surgical sectors. There was a lot of these countries were relying on on like overall subsidies, but also on import restrictions. So it's a bit more muddled. It wasn't just your textbook. We have, say, financial constraints or other frictions, or sort of learning by doing, and then we're going to have a subsidy to production that's going to be in this amount, it's going to last for this long. This is not what these countries were doing, which is a much more heavier hand, and it turned out to work out. Okay, so that's a lesson as well. Um, but picking winners and all this stuff, it's a very complicated thing. What I tend to advise governments is, yeah, if you want to call that industrial policy, fine, but there's certainly a bunch of things that countries should do to kind of boost the industrial sector, then boost maybe the economy more broadly, even in the services, which have to do with infrastructure, education, skill, human capital accumulation, that have to do with regulation, like barriers to entry. There's a lot of first order issues that are inhibiting growth, um, that you want to get rid of, you want to tackle first, and then opening is going to be much easier. Okay. If in addition you want to hold their hands and help them somehow, fine, but like not dealing with the domestic distortions and just sort of pushing for like blunt trade policies, I think that's generally a recipe for disaster. I mean, think about China. I mean, they went through massive um, schooling, improve like increasing schooling, infrastructure. There's a lot in the background that was not just picking winners, but basically the hukou system that sort of was flexible enough to allow for migration and things like that. There's a lot in the background that, without picking sectors, facilitated that growth. I mean, and that obviously the government has a lot to play in that way, but like less about picking this sector or that and just sort of helping people generally.
If we have the time, I would have another question, if that's fine.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, first of all, for the interesting talk. I'm personally currently working on my master thesis ideas and working a lot more on development economics, but I've had courses with also your colleague Jaume Ventura on trade. My question with regards to it almost kind of connects a bit to the question with regards to the tariffs, is how would you see these thoughts about international trade connected with thoughts of development economics, especially with regards to topic like structural transformation? In many trade theories, obviously in rather the older ones where we have actual specialization in different industries, we would see kind of indications for high TFP or like high productivity sectors concentrating in certain countries, for example, TSMC in Taiwan, while lower productivity sectors might be produced in other countries, which could be a barrier for development. Just first thought. I wanted to ask you if you see any connections between international trade and development, or important bridges which have to be made between the two fields, especially with regards to structural transition. Thank you.
I mean, good question. I don't think that's all that different from the question that Carlos was asking. I mean, you're kind of pushing again the notion that the process of development is moving labor force from low productivity sectors to high productivity sectors. And I'm not sure, there's certainly a process of structural transformation. And there's certainly a process like from, first agricultural to industry to services. There's maybe some movement of workers within sectors to higher productivity firms. These things are things that folks in macro development are working out. I'm less sure that there's good evidence that this is all driven by or like tied to government policies or anything like that. I mean, if you have a process of you improve schooling, your labor force, you encourage female labor participation and things like that, that is naturally, or you kind of teach English and things like that, that's naturally going to lead to these transitions without like really holding people's hands and maybe having them move from this sector to the other sector. You know what I mean? So I don't think that. So fully agree that this structural transformation or reducing misallocation, a la Shea, Kleno, however you want to call it, is an important part of development. And certainly in terms of learning by doing, there's a massive literature on this, like a lot of it theory of how you can get stuck if you specialize in the wrong sectors, and then the other countries get better, the more dynamic sectors, and then there's no way to catch up. Less evidence that this is sort of first order relative to other frictions, but certainly I haven't seen a lot of evidence that indicates that that very directed policies of like, the government goes and estimates this learning curves or whatever, and then figures out which are the right sectors. I don't think that the Taiwanese stuff, for instance, I don't, my understanding is it's not about the Taiwanese government in the 1970s figuring out this is what we should be doing. This is about a US trained Taiwanese citizen that at some point decides to go back, understands that there's a lot of talented people, highly skilled force, and then it goes from there. You know what I mean? It's not industrial policy in the very surgical point of view. But obviously there's some fundamentals of the Taiwanese economy that were crucial for this to happen. Okay. So that's, again, I mean, I'm giving you a similar answer, but I don't think this is it's a somewhat connected question.
Thank you very much.
I'll ask a question if that's okay. Somewhat related to the previous two. I was very interested by slide 9 on your presentation showing the map. You don't have to look, just showing the fact that in Southeast Asia in particular, you see lots of GVC participation, and you don't see that as much in Africa and Latin America.
Yep.
And I was wondering what you would hypothesize the main reasons for that to be. A big one would probably be proximity to China. And if you're kind of an intermediate manufacturer, then the proximity there. But I don't know if that would be the most compelling reason in your opinion.
Yeah, so good question. Slide 9 was on semiconductors, but your point stands more broadly. That is, I could have brought in like measures, a world map with indices of GVCA participation, and those, as you pointed out, their lowest among the lowest are in South America and in Africa. People have looked at it's always hard to kind of do things in a super clean causal manner, right? But people that I was involved in 2020. There's a World Development Report, which is the flagship publication the World Bank produces every year. And I was involved in the 2021, which was on global value chains. And a team there did exactly this empirical analysis of what are some of the factors that explain increased GVC participation. Infrastructure mattered a lot. And infrastructure is infrastructure and geography. I mean, there's a lot of countries in South America, but especially in Africa that are landlocked. That is always an issue. Okay, infrastructure in terms of roads, ports, skill, human capital. is very important in some sectors. Like most FDI in this continent is in natural resources, which is not necessarily the sectors where you want to be, because the type of stuff that is done in those countries, like mining and things like that, or extraction, are not very high value added. So institutions, to some extent, contract enforcement is weaker in some of these places. But yeah, South America is a bit of a challenge in the sense that, there's a lot of investment from Spain. For instance, Spanish firms have invested a lot in South America, but it's almost only in utilities and back in the day and petroleum and things like that. I think sort of the institutional aspects are important. Political stability, obviously, right? I mean, in South America, it's like, I don't know, it's probably some South Americans I'm going to offend here, but I mean, if you put your hands, if you put yourself in the feet of the feet of a businessman, I mean, do you want to go and invest massively in Argentina? I mean, that seems like a place where the government is very nice to you these days. But then what's going to happen in 3 years, right? I mean, then the far left comes in, and maybe you get expropriated. These swings are really problematic. And global value chains, they require large investments. I mean, if you want to have a wafer fabrication plant, this is not something you put together in a couple of weeks. I mean, when TSMC opened a plant in Arizona, I mean, that's like a massive investment. You want some, sense that you're going to be able to be there for a while. Okay. And if you think about South America and Africa, I mean, there's not a lot of countries where you can have that stability.
Thank you.
All right.
Very well. If there aren't any further questions, I think we'll leave it here. Thanks again, Professor. This was a great talk. So thank you for sharing your insights with us. It was our pleasure hosting you.
My pleasure. Good luck to everybody. If you have questions that haven't been answered, you know where to find me. Okay. And I'm AC in Barcelona sooner or later.
Great.
Ciao.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye.
very much. Bye bye.